It was cold, and Richard and Mark were ready to head home. The two roommates had ventured out for a walk in the park, only to realize they were the only ones daring enough to brave the freezing weather. As they hurried back, a faint noise caught their attention. It came from behind a nearby tree, soft enough that anyone else might have missed it. Mark, who spent most of his free time volunteering at animal shelters, instantly recognized the sound. It was a dog, though he couldn't imagine why it would be out alone in such harsh conditions. They wondered if something had happened to its owner, leaving the poor animal to fend for itself. They heard the sound again and carefully approached the tree, hoping not to startle the creature. As they drew closer, they spotted a small figure curled up into a tight ball, shivering so intensely that patches of snow had collected on its fur. The dog was motionless, its breathing shallow, as if it had surrendered to the cold. The two men circled around the dog until they were right in front of it, but it barely acknowledged their presence. Richard knelt down and gently lifted the dog's face. The sight was heartbreaking. Its eyes remained shut, and it seemed to have no energy left, barely clinging to life. Mark tried softly coaxing it to open its eyes, but the dog stayed unresponsive, its thin body almost frozen and emaciated. It wasn't just a dog left out in the cold. It was a stray that had likely suffered through the brutal winter on its own. Suddenly, they noticed something else. A smaller figure nestled beside the dog, curled up with its face pressed into the dog's fur for warmth. Richard leaned closer, curiosity overtaking him, and gently turned it over. Both men jumped back in shock as they realized what the tiny figure actually was. It wasn't just another animal, it was a baby, wrapped tightly against the dog for warmth. "Hey, are you okay?" Richard asked softly, touching the little girl's cold, still body. She didn't respond. Without hesitation, he removed his scarf and wrapped it around her, then gently lifted her into his arms. Mark did the same with the dog, which was limp and barely breathing. The girl's body was icy to the touch, and she was completely unconscious. She looked no older than 10, and it was clear that both she and the dog desperately needed immediate care. Realizing the urgency, Richard and Mark knew they had to act fast, and splitting up was the only option. Richard quickly called the emergency services while Mark, familiar with local animal shelters from his volunteer work, began reaching out to any veterinarians he knew. Unfortunately, with the holidays in full swing, most were closed. But they didn't give up, understanding that any delay could be critical. Within 30 minutes, an ambulance arrived, and Richard accompanied the girl to the hospital, whispering words of encouragement in hopes that she could hear. Meanwhile, Mark called one last place, a non-profit pet project he'd heard about. Fortunately, someone answered, and after hearing Mark's urgent description, they arranged for him to bring the dog over immediately. At the shelter, a vet was ready and waiting. They found the dog had a few minor injuries, but miraculously would survive despite its exposure to the freezing weather. At the hospital, the little girl was rushed into intensive care. She wore only a thin winter jacket, gloves, and boots, but after enduring the bitter cold for so long, her body was almost completely rigid. Her skin was pale, and her temperature had plummeted to a dangerously low 25 degrees Celsius, far below the normal 37 degrees Celsius. Her heart beat weakly, just once every few seconds. Doctors and nurses worked quickly, determined to stabilize her. They wrapped her in heated blankets, attached her to a respirator, and began checking her organs for signs of damage. Fortunately, her kidneys, liver, intestines, and lungs were all still functioning, though under significant strain. Nurses replaced her cold, damp clothing with warm, fresh garments, while doctors used advanced devices to circulate blood, helping to warm her organs and support her body's recovery. As they watched her vitals gradually improve, Richard and Mark felt a cautious sense of relief. Despite the cold and the odds, both the girl and her loyal dog had made it to safety, thanks to their teamwork and a shared determination to help. Mark joined Richard, and together they waited anxiously for updates about the girl. However, the hospital staff, bound by confidentiality rules, could only share minimal information with them since she was a minor. All the doctor could tell them was that she was out of immediate danger, though her recovery would be long. The doctor reassured them that the girl was going to survive, and they both felt a wave of relief wash over them. The dog's loyalty and courage had likely saved her life, keeping her warm through the cold night. Despite their questions about how she'd ended up alone in the park, all that mattered now was her safety. The next morning, determined to help, Richard and Mark went to the police department to report what they knew about the girl. They described her features, the location where they'd found her, and shared the hospital details. To their relief, the police confirmed a missing persons report had been filed for a child matching her description. Her family had been searching for her for nearly 24 hours and had just been alerted that she was safe at the hospital. Eager for more updates, Richard and Mark decided to return to the hospital. The doctors informed them that overnight, the girl had faced several challenges, including multiple seizures due to extreme hypothermia. A doctor had stayed by her side, monitoring her condition closely. Despite the rough night, by morning her body temperature was stable, and doctors were hopeful she would soon regain full consciousness. As a gesture of gratitude for finding her, the hospital staff allowed Richard and Mark a single visit to see the girl before her family arrived. The two friends thanked the doctor and quietly entered her room. To their surprise, the girl was already awake, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with visible confusion. Too weak to move much, she still attempted to sit up, her small hands struggling to push herself off the bed. Seeing this, the nurse immediately alerted the doctor, and Richard and Mark were gently ushered from the room. As they left, they couldn't shake the thought of the resilient child and the brave dog who had protected her. Although they would now need the family's permission to visit again, Richard and Mark felt a sense of closure, knowing she was in safe hands and on the road to recovery. For them, the experience was a reminder of the unexpected strength found in both human and animal bonds, and as they walked home, they couldn't help but feel grateful to have been part of the girl's miraculous rescue. While they waited outside, hoping for news, they noticed a woman rushing into the hospital, her face etched with worry. "Where is Naomi? Where's my daughter?" she called out, her voice trembling. Even her companion struggled to calm her down. A nurse quickly led the anxious mother down the hall, disappearing from sight. When the nurse returned, Mark asked for an update. She explained that the woman was indeed the young girl's mother. Having just learned her daughter was safe, she had come to be by her side. The familiarity of her mother's presence had helped calm Naomi, and she was now receiving further treatment. Feeling a sense of closure, Richard and Mark decided it was time to go. They had done all they could. Before leaving, the nurse asked them to leave a contact number just in case. 2 days later, an unexpected call came in. It was Naomi's mother, expressing her desire to thank them in person. They agreed to meet her at a cafe near the park where they'd found Naomi. When they arrived, they were pleasantly surprised to find that Naomi herself was there too. She looked worlds away from the little girl they'd found shivering in the snow. Her mother, Freya, greeted them warmly and thanked them deeply for saving her daughter. Over coffee, Freya explained what had happened. Naomi usually walked home from school alone as her house wasn't far and the neighborhood was considered safe. But on that day, a sudden blizzard had struck, covering the streets in 2 feet of snow and creating drifts that blocked doorways. The storm grew worse, and as visibility dropped, Naomi had unknowingly drifted farther from home. Trying to find shelter from the cold, she grew more disoriented in the swirling snow. Exhausted and freezing, she eventually collapsed to the ground, her strength fading. Her next memory was waking up in the hospital, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and the warmth of the hospital bed. Freya explained that she and others had searched the neighborhood for an entire day, but with the intense storm and poor visibility, no one had been able to find her. Freya then asked about the dog they'd mentioned, curious to know more about the animal that had kept her daughter warm through the freezing night. Richard shared the details. They had found Naomi curled up beside a stray dog who had protected her from the bitter cold. The dog was currently recovering at the vet, and its injuries were healing well. Freya expressed a heartfelt hope that the dog would be adopted by a loving family. Richard and Mark assured her that the shelter staff would make sure the dog found a safe home, possibly even with someone who would cherish it for the loyal companion it had proven to be. Thankfully, Richard and Mark had shared the dog's story with the vet, who then passed it along to the animal shelter. Moved by the tale, the shelter posted about the brave dog's heroic actions on social media, and they were soon flooded with adoption requests. Though they couldn't trace where the dog had originally come from, they suspected she had been abandoned. Her gentle nature and good manners around people hinted that she'd once been cared for. This time, the shelter was committed to ensuring she found a truly loving, permanent home. After careful screening, they narrowed down the choices to 2 families, ready to begin the adoption process. But Naomi's mother had something else in mind. No one could be more grateful for the dog who had saved her daughter, and she couldn't imagine a more fitting companion for their family. Naomi had shared, in moments of quiet reflection, how the dog's presence on that frigid night had given her warmth and courage. Through tears and relief, she described how, despite her fear and exhaustion, the dog had stayed by her side, easing her loneliness and providing a sense of safety that only a loving companion could. After Naomi was released from the hospital, her heartwarming recollections only deepened her mother's gratitude. Since that day, Naomi often asked about the dog, wondering what had become of her, and her mother could see the longing in her eyes whenever she spoke of her rescuer. For Naomi's mother, simply knowing the dog would be in good hands didn't feel like enough. There was something undeniably special between Naomi and this gentle, brave animal, and she wanted to make sure that bond would continue. She couldn't bear the thought of Daisy ending up in another family without having the chance to be loved by the very girl she had saved. Both mother and daughter agreed. They wanted the dog to be part of their family. It was a decision born of immense gratitude and love, and they knew they would do everything to give her a safe and happy life. Mark, who had been deeply moved by their story, quickly offered them the contact information for the animal shelter. They reached out immediately, and the shelter staff was delighted to hear from them. Not only had the shelter already received a flood of interest from people touched by the dog's story, but they were particularly thrilled that the family she had saved wanted to give her a forever home. The staff welcomed their request, guiding Naomi's family through each step of the adoption process. For the next few weeks, Naomi and her mother learned everything they could about caring for a pet. They had never had one before, but they were determined to provide Daisy with the love and security she deserved. The shelter gave them tips on feeding, health and training, as well as suggestions on how to help her settle into her new home. Naomi, filled with anticipation, spent her free time preparing a cozy corner for Daisy, adding a soft bed, toys, and even a small nameplate she had made herself. Finally, the big day arrived. Naomi and her mother could barely contain their excitement as they approached the shelter to bring Daisy home. Naomi's heart raced, and she wondered if the dog would remember her. But as soon as they entered the room, Daisy's eyes lit up, and she bounded over to Naomi with joyful recognition. She nuzzled into Naomi's hand, wagging her tail furiously as if to say, "I remember you." Naomi's mother watched, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride, as she knelt down beside her daughter to pet Daisy and softly thank her for watching over Naomi on that cold night. When they arrived home, Daisy trotted in, her eyes bright with curiosity as she explored her new surroundings. Naomi proudly showed her to the cozy corner they had prepared just for her. Daisy sniffed around, gently nudging the soft blankets and testing out her new bed. It seemed she understood that this was her space, her home, and she curled up comfortably as if she had been there all along. For Naomi and her mother, watching Daisy settle in so easily was both a relief and a joy. They had been worried about being new pet owners, but Daisy's gentle nature reassured them, and they quickly felt at ease. In the days that followed, Naomi and her mother created new routines that now included Daisy. Each morning, Naomi would fill Daisy's water bowl and give her breakfast, a responsibility she took on proudly. In the afternoons, they would take Daisy to the park for a walk, where she would bound excitedly through the grass, her tail wagging as she met other dogs. Daisy quickly made a new friend, a Labrador named Max, who became her playmate during these daily outings. Seeing Daisy's joyful energy brought an unexpected lightness to Naomi and her mother's lives, filling their home with laughter and love. Daisy's presence soon felt like a natural part of their family, and Naomi's mother marveled at how fate had brought them together. Not only had Daisy saved Naomi, but she had also given them a deeper appreciation for resilience and the unexpected ways love can find us. Their bond with Daisy was unlike anything they had experienced, and every day they felt more grateful for the twist of fate that had led them to her. For Naomi, having Daisy in her life was a comfort and a joy. She often whispered to her friend, "You're my hero," as she petted her before bed. Daisy's loyalty, warmth, and playful spirit had helped Naomi feel safe and loved, and in return, Naomi showed her endless kindness and affection. Together, they shared an unbreakable bond, each giving the other a sense of belonging and trust. In Daisy, Naomi and her mother had not only found a pet but a true friend. Daisy, too, seemed to know she was finally home, where she would be cherished and cared for as she deserved. And with Daisy by their side, Naomi and her mother felt their family was complete, knowing that their paths had crossed in the most extraordinary and beautiful way. Their lives had been forever changed, and they couldn't imagine a day without Daisy's joyful presence, reminding them of the power of love, loyalty, and second chances.